Of Blood and Steel, written by Seymour Zainali, narrated by James Lawrence. Prologue. Reuben returned home from a busy day of farming with his son. He waited patiently while his daughter finished setting the table. His wife, Sona, was rolling dough and slapping it onto the walls of their hot clay oven. He smiled at his wife, and she smiled back. A dusting of flour coated her shiny face. "Dinner's almost ready," she told him. Reuben sat down at the head of the table, and his son sat beside him. His daughter brought the jug of wine and filled up his goblet. "Pour your brother some wine," he told her. "Are you sure?" Sona began. "I was his age when I had my first cup. The boy's worked hard today. He deserves it." Sona nodded to her husband. She carried over the cow's feet that had been boiling in water all day in preparation for the stew. Sona placed the pot in the center of the table and garnished it with salt and garlic. Mariam poured her mother a cup, then grabbed herself a goblet of water and sat down with her father and brother, while her mother continued to serve cucumbers, radishes, cheese, and cress with her freshly made flatbread. "Just the thing for a wet, cold night," Reuben told his family. Sona passed the bread to her children, and Reuben raised his cup to his family. They all waited for Karnak to take his first ever swig of wine. He took a rather large gulp, screwed up his face, and spat most of it back into the cup. His face turned ashen, and he gulped again. The family erupted with laughter. "You'll get used to the taste, son," Reuben told him. "But get water, if you please." As Reuben lifted his cup to his face and took a sip of wine, there were suddenly 3 stout knocks on their door. The room fell silent, and Sona's eyes widened, showing surprise. It was after dark, and normally people from the village did not stop by at such a late hour, if indeed it was someone from the village. "Everyone, just stay where you are," Reuben ordered. He rose to his feet and crossed the room, fetching the only thing that passed for a weapon in his house, an old blunt scythe. Its shaft was missing, but it would do. The knocks came again, but they were louder this time. The solid wooden door juddered in its frame. With a deep inhale, Reuben held the scythe down at his side and opened the door. A cold wind swept inward to meet him, and he shivered. A stranger, over 2 meters tall, loomed in the murk outside. Reuben looked up. The man was wearing a heavy cloth hood that partially obscured his face. His bare and bulging arms were twice as thick as Reuben's, even though he himself looked strong. The man bore the look of a brigand, a hardened leather cuirass wrapped around his hulking form, which was battered, aged, and clad with patches of mail. Across his torso, a handful of rusted plates hung loosely, and he wore gauntlets, boots, and greaves, all of which provided meager protection. His skin was densely painted in fat pink scars. Reuben gasped as he noticed the 2-meter-long sword slung over the man's shoulder. A finely crafted steel claymore with a black handle. It looked priceless and contrasted directly with his attire. He couldn't help but think it was stolen. "How may I help you, traveler?" Reuben steadied himself and narrowed his eyes. "I'm looking for Varda Nazarian." The stranger spoke deeply with a throat full of splinters, though his tone was an amicable one. "Vardan? You bear the look of him yourself." "That's because I'm his son. Are you a friend of his?" "Yes." Reuben noticed the man eyeing up the table full of food. "Would you like to join us?" Yes, that would be very kind of you." The stranger ducked into the house, his sword dragging and scraping behind him as he did so. It left a deep scratch on the floor. "I'm Reuben." The farmer chuckled nervously and waved the stranger in. "My children, of course, and my wife, Sona." "Greetings." The burly stranger was met with smiling faces. He peeled back his hood, revealing a stern face and long, slovenly hair. "Please," Reuben insisted with open palms, "take a seat." "Thanks." The man sat down at the table, and the chair creaked and groaned beneath his weight. "Don't let it bother you." Reuben patted the man on the back and sat. "Now then, let's eat. I'll take you to see my father after dinner." The stranger nodded in agreement. The family ate in silence with their guest, who ate like he hadn't eaten in several weeks rather than days. The children eyed the stranger up and down, watching him in amazement as he shoveled down the stew, cow's feet, and flatbread. "It's good," the stranger told Sona. Food spilled from his mouth and ran down his smooth chin. He used the back of his hand to wipe it away. Sona nodded. The children giggled among themselves. Then Karnak turned to the man. "Are you a giant? I've never seen anyone eat so much," he said. "Let the man eat first. You can ask questions later," Sona snapped. The man stopped eating and slowly turned his head to the boy. "I am not a giant, but I do have an appetite, especially for little children." There was a silence, and the children sunk into their chairs as they looked up at the man. For a brief moment, the table was still and quiet, with only the fire crackling. Then the man slapped the table and released an earth-shaking laugh. The family looked at each other before joining in with the laughter. After dinner, the children were sent to bed, leaving the adults to share a drink around the roaring fire. It was evident to Reuben that the stranger had not tasted wine in quite some time, for he guzzled it down. As friendly as the evening might have been, Reuben couldn't help but feel uneasy. "So," Reuben puffed on his pipe, dense burls of smoke drifting from it, "would you speak with me, then? Did you know my father well?" "Well enough, though some time ago." "Are you from these parts?" Sona asked as she moved closer to her husband, linking her arm through his. "Your accent is familiar." "Near enough." He set his own goblet down on the hearth and leaned back in his chair. "Can I see him now?" Reuben found himself staring at the massive sword the man had left by the door, though he could not deny the man's amicable manner. To that end, Reuben swallowed his fear and agreed to his guest's request. "So be it." He forced a smile and stood. "I'll just light a torch." Sona grabbed his cloak and put it over Reuben's shoulders. They exchanged a polite but furtive glance. "Don't forget your gloves, all right? You'll catch your death out there in that cold," she said. From beside the hearth, Reuben took a short stave, half wrapped in burlap and caked in sulphur and lime, and plunged it into the flames. "And be careful," Sona added as he opened the door. Reuben smiled and nodded. "Lead the way." The man stood facing Reuben. They departed, both of them pulling their hoods up to shield themselves from the rain. The farmer's nerves were put at ease, as the man had left his sword behind. They walked side by side in the sputtering glow of the torch without words, each of the men hunched to protect themselves from the chill. At the edge of Reuben's land, they ascended in silence. There was no sound other than the leaden plops of the rain and the faraway hooting of an owl in the dark. They reached the top and crossed the grassy plateau, headed toward the larch. There, at the base of the gigantic tree that stood more than 30 meters tall, were 2 gravestones in a row. "On the left is my mother, and on the right, my father." Reuben pointed out each in succession. The man knelt beside Vardanazarian's stone, gently tracing his fingers across the inscription. "How did he die?" "He passed peacefully in his bed, with his family at his side. He was always a man of hearty constitution. So you knew him, then?" "We worked together closely." "Oh." Reuben was nodding absent-mindedly, but suddenly he put the pieces together. "Oh, The skin traders. Slaving, yes. Unfortunate ways at the best of times, Reuben shrugged. It's not something I'm proud of, but he was my father, and I loved him regardless. Those days are far behind me now. Perhaps the times really can change. Only if we change them. Their eyes scanned the domed stones marking the grave, but said nothing more. True. The stranger nodded in agreement, almost to himself. Tell me, do you know what became of your father's slaves? Some of them escaped, but most of them died of sickness during the outbreak. It was a rampant and virulent thing, this sickness. The body count was in the hundreds all across the lands. Corpses of plague in the ground posed too great a risk to the living, not to mention the crops. What became of them then? A nightmarish fate. Reuben could feel himself turning pale just thinking about it. I remember that morning all too well. I woke up at the crack of dawn, before light had even broken. Outside our house stood a garrison of soldiers overlooking slaves digging their own graves. A pit so massive you needed ladders just to climb in and out. Big as it was, the bodies still piled high out of it by the time it was all over. It took barrels of warm pitch to cover the lot. The fire raged for 3 long days. I'll never forget that smell, burning flesh. It hung around the farm like some vile mist for weeks on end after. I thanked the Maker my own children hadn't been born by then. Ghastly. The stranger wore a pained look, as though he himself had been cast upon the grisly pyre. This was some time ago, then? Oh, must be 13, 15 years now, nearly. I could never take on another workforce. Now, I am the one who owns it, and I am the one who sows it. As are we all. Yes. Reuben hesitated, sensing sorrow in the man's voice. Are you all right, brother? I'm sorry our conversation took such a grim turn. Leave me be. Right. Well, it's certainly getting cold out now, and wet. Will you stay the night with us? My father's bed lies empty. I'm sure he wouldn't mind lending it out to an old friend. No, The stranger seemed to tussle with the decision. I should really be going. I've stayed here long enough. You sure? Long way to travel still? You could say that. Well, come, let's head back to the house and fix you a flask of something warm for the road. No. His voice was firm. I'll stay here a while and then be on my way. As you wish. Reuben nervously looked at the stranger, wanting to shake his hand, but the man was too deep in his own thoughts. Just remember, our door is always open to you. The stranger replied with silence. Good night. With that, Reuben left the stranger atop the hill and made his way back toward his house. He found himself walking away with more questions than answers, but as far as he could tell, the man had gotten what he came for. As he returned home, Sona was outing lanterns and putting the copper mesh fireguard in place on the hearth. She was puzzled to see her husband return alone. "Reuben, what happened to our guest?" she asked. "I think he needs some time alone. He's staying beneath the larch and then heading on his way. I did offer, but—" Reuben shrugged. "He seems deeply saddened by something. A man of his stature probably wants to face his sorrow on his own. Shame, though. It's really freezing out tonight." "Oh, thank the Maker. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a bit relieved." "How so?" "Well, he was quite frightening in his way. Were you not intimidated at all?" "Oh, I suppose he was. And yes, I was intimidated, but you mustn't judge a man by his looks alone." "You have too much faith in people, Reuben." She threw her arms around his neck and kissed him hard. "That's why I married you." "Not for the land, then?" He grinned. No, it might surprise you, but the constant smell of animal manure just didn't seal the deal for me." The couple shared a hearty, muted fit of laughter, careful not to wake the children. "Then it has to be my other attributes you keep hanging around for." He held her tight around the waist. "Don't be gross. It's late." Sona couldn't help but smirk at her husband's clumsy advances. "It is." 3 stout knocks came upon their door, and once more the solid wood juddered in its frame. It nearly jolted the pair out of their skins. "Reuben, is it him again?" Sona whispered. I thought he'd gone." "He did, but—" "Ah!" Making for the door again, Reuben realized why the man must have returned. "He forgot his sword. No matter. You go along. I'll be up in a minute." "1 minute, Reuben. You know I don't like to be kept waiting." Sona winked at her husband. "I certainly do." He chuckled to himself when she was out of earshot. Approaching the door, he took the sword in one hand, almost collapsing beneath the weight as he lifted it. He thought it only for slaying dragons or giants, and wondered what a traveling mercenary would do with such a weapon in a skirmish or man-on-man fight. He wondered how the thing could even be swung. Reuben unlocked his door for the second time that cold night.